Chapter 21. Psych Home. Being on point at all times was a life or death situation because it was obvious that a lot of the convicts here seemed to belong in St. Elizabeth Mental Hospital. Occoquan was a psych home. I saw men lusting at other men that worked in teams just to flash their genitalias at some of the female officers, men that would walk behind a female officer masturbating inside of their oversized jumpsuits, men that ignored the AIDS epidemic. One would shoot dope into his veins, and then to make sure he got all of the heroin, he would pull his blood into the syringe to flush it, and then push it back into his veins. Then he would pass that needle to the next man, who would repeat the exact same thing without cleaning the syringe with bleach. Men that obviously had emotional issues, walking around mad at the world and looking for someone to take it out on. They were serving humongous sentences for kidnapping, armed robbery, or murder, and seemed to want to add on to that sentence with more murders. People were being stabbed and killed daily. Some of these men referred to the whole, solitary confinement, as jail, which meant they saw population at the prison as freedom. It made no sense to incarcerate people with these psychiatric illnesses or drug abuse problems. They needed help, counseling, and treatment. They were dealing with the symptoms of childhood traumatic experiences, neglect, and sometimes sexual molestation. A prison and the feelings of failure would only exacerbate these issues and push them into extreme aggression, more drug abuse, suicide, suicidal acts, or a much deeper depression. And a lot of the men here had one or all of those symptoms. In this environment, I had to sleep with my knife for safety, but it also came with risk. Cops would sometimes run into the dormitory while everyone was asleep to do surprise shakedowns. Or you could be attacked by another convict while you were asleep. I decided to take that risk. I also took note that it was only one officer in charge of 100+ convicts, so every man was on his own. I was in a wide open dormitory filled with strangers. I had to be extremely vigilant and aware of my surroundings. I knew how to maneuver amongst men, and I knew most men didn't attack other men for no reason. The reason could be petty, but it had to be a reason, and I didn't know if any of these strangers had a reason. Norton was considered one of the worst penal systems in America. It was known for robberies, extortion, and at one time rape. It was easy to spot the thieves and the robbers. They were always scheming. It was easy to spot the flunkies. They were always taking orders. It was also easy to spot the dope fiends. They were always sweating, scratching, and nodding. They were always dancing or cleaning up. They were always running game and fast talking. I had to watch them all simultaneously because they were all right before me in this open dormitory. Crack wasn't prevalent because crackheads in prison didn't have any money. Plus, crack was too expensive in prison. $50 to $100 for a 10-minute high would break a millionaire in months. Heroin, which was the most important narcotic on earth, was the main high and cash cow. Dope deals were being conducted in the open in the dormitory. Some of the guys selling dope were paying tuitions for their children, buying cars for their wives, and paying mortgages. Some of them were the breadwinners for their families in society. This was also a way to stay connected and relevant in the household. Heroin controlled Norton like it did every other prison and the streets. It was loved because it had no odor and gave up a couple-hour high. And the high was the best high that money could buy. I thought heroin was a drug exclusively used by elders. But down here, it was also young people snorting and shooting it into their veins. It mostly came from being curious, wanting to be cool, peer pressure, fear, or intimidation. After a few weeks of being on the compound, an elder saw me smoking weed and insinuated that it was no good. The smoke was too loud and obvious and would easily alert the police. And when the smoke was in the air, it was hard to determine where it was coming from. So if an asshole cop was working, he may decide to take a urine analysis of a few random people or conduct a shakedown looking for the weed. Someone else could get in trouble for a dirty urine, or he may stumble up and find something that belongs to someone else. Then it would be my fault for that person getting caught or taking a loss, and I would have to answer for that. Any man that lost thousands of dollars worth of narcotics that could feed the compound and pay his mortgage with the proceeds would naturally want a savage stabbing to the one that caused it, even if it wasn't intentional. He also said heroin was the best thing for me to use because it allowed a temporary escape of floating into dreamland. Plus it wasn't pungent or stayed in your system for weeks at a time like weed did. A random urine analysis 2 weeks after you smoked a joint could still leave you with a disciplinary report for a dirty urine, which could lead to a 2-year set-off from the parole board. But heroin was out of your system within 48 hours. A few laps around the ball field and a couple cups of water could remove it from your system even faster. To sweeten the pot for his unhinged advice, he said, "And when you go home, all the honeys is going to be in love with you once you give them the dope dip." They said being high off the heroin kept your dick hard for hours, and women loved the marathon sex that the dope provided. I snarled at his proposal and continued smoking weed, just with some caution and awareness. A few of the other young guys on the compound put the weed down and began snorting the bone. Years later, they all had abscesses filled with pus from main veining and were in and out of rehabs. The best survivors of prison are the ones who had mastered not only thinking for himself, but thinking for everyone else.